The following is a Kingfisher Media podcast.
Hey, you're listening to When the Bough Breaks. My name is AC Fisher, and with me today is a man that in my world needs no introduction, but for some of you, you may want one. Seth is probably best known as the host of the Thinking Atheist Podcast. He's a published author with at least 3 books that I'm aware of. In addition to his podcast, he's an atheist activist. Prior to his work in the atheist community, he was a fundamentalist Christian and even worked for 10 years as a Christian radio host. Seth, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invite. It's good to be here.
So, as you know, this show is all about family estrangement. Everything I've heard about your story over the years has sort of clued me into the fact that your estrangement story is not your typical kind of one. Because you're such a well-practiced speaker, you've got a great sense of, how to tell your own story. Maybe I'll just let you tell us a little bit about how this whole family complication sort of got started for you.
Well, the foundation is one of, and I was rooted in a fundamentalist faith. My normal was a literal Bible, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, Jesus came and died on a cross, and a literal scripture. And everything we did was wrapped around my parents' religion. It was the schools we attended, the music we listened to, the clothing we wore, the friends we had. And, they were insanely proud of their children when we would go out and emulate that Christianity. I was a student leader. They loved that, student council president. And I'm on stage during the school chapel services, and I'm reading verses and we're leading prayers and being the nice young man. They are so proud. And because I had some communication skills and a love for Christian music, I got into Christian radio in 1990. And they considered that kind of a form of ministry. And they were so proud. Our son is ministering the gospel. He is carrying the torch, carrying the mantle. And then I became a Christian video producer, or a video producer for a company that served mostly church clients. So now I'm doing another kind of ministry. And we're so proud. And he's exactly what we wanted, that kind of thing. But, when you start to challenge that, and when you begin to resist and disagree, you begin to see the evidence of a conditionality of love. My parents loved me, but as far as acceptance, that was 1,000% until I started to think for myself.
Yeah.
And I started to disagree. And then I began to see them close down parts of themselves. And I don't think they did it to be cruel. I think they see it as a kind of tough love, right? If we're too accepting, then we're endorsing this guy as he's off, he's off the reservation. He's the prodigal, and we don't want to be that. We want to try to, bring him back to the fold. Sometimes you got to be stern to do that. Stern rebukes, And so that led to what has been, I started sort of my hardcore journey out of the faith back in 2007 at 13 years. So it's been off and on 13 years. The last couple of years have been pretty quiet just because I drew some extremely hard lines in the sand. But, we're not close. In some very important ways, we're strangers. Our paths cross every once in a long while. A little bit of small talk. Good to see you. Have a nice day. We go on with our lives. But a lot goes on under the surface there,
Do you have intentional communications with your parents at all?
Yeah, a couple of days ago, I got a text, or, I get the occasional text. Usually it's just a note that your mom loves you and God loves you. It's something along those lines, I just let those go. Mom called the other night and we had like a 15-minute conversation, probably the first one we'd had in 3 months. Hey, how's it going? How's dad? His health isn't great, you guys being safe during COVID. How are things? What are you guys up to? And But you can feel in those conversations, you can feel all that is not being said. My parents have a much deeper relationship with their other children. I have a twin sister, right? She's 5 minutes older than I am. And she is a devout Bible believer, church going, Sunday go to meeting, I love Jesus, God warrior, human being. And they love that about her, and I think because of that, they're more transparent with her and they have just a bigger bond, a greater bond. They're friends.
Yeah.
And, my parents and I, we're family in the sense of bio family. We're friendly when we get together, but we're not really friends. I don't think we hugely look forward to the times that our paths cross. There have been a lot of words that have been said, a lot of emails and texts and just terrible phone calls and judgment and shame and confusion and rejection. And it's hard to get excited about going over to mom's house. I mean, even virtually, hey, a Zoom call with mom. It's hard to get excited about that when you feel like that they have checked their acceptance of you. And so I feel a sense of distance. It's like I look at my family through glass. I've said on the podcast, sometimes I feel like I'm related to people that I don't relate to.
Yeah.
And that's hard, because we are a family, but what do we really have in common? Do we really, do we have that sort of, I don't know, are they able to let down their guard? Like no one ever asks me, how's work going? They ask each other, how's work going? How were your travels back when I was traveling? They didn't ask me, how was the recent free thought or humanist convention? Never. How was church? They'll do that. How was your mission trip? But they never talk to me about my life because it's like the thing we don't speak of. And, it doesn't take long before you feel othered. You feel like an outsider. And so then you go and you choose family, people who accept you and respect you for who you are. And that's largely what I've done in my own circle, the family you choose.
No, like that can be hard because I spent 6 years estranged from my mom, and we've this past summer we kind of reconnected, and I think we covered a lot of ground as far as sorting out our misunderstandings of each other. And I've come to a place where I really do love and appreciate my mom, and I look forward to speaking with her. But I can identify with a lot of what you're saying as far as how there's certain questions that she won't ask. There's certain details that I feel like I got to hold back from volunteering. And it's complicated because what you're saying, you're related to these people, but there's always going to be that separation. And, for me, I came to realize that I never really had a great connection with my mom, even back when I was a Christian, though we did have a lot to talk about. Like, I'm wondering with you and your parents, you'd said that they were proud of you for all your work in the Christian circles and whatnot. But do you feel like your relationship had actual substance back when you were still a believer?
I do. A lot of it, I was never like a mama's boy or daddy's boy kind of. I was always different than my siblings. Like, they were peacekeepers. And even when I was a believer, I was a crusader. I loved to argue. I loved to debate. I was out there fighting for what I thought was right. Back then it was Jesus-oriented stuff. I was on the front lines. I was kind of a ham. I can keep to myself easily. I can keep my own company very well. And that way I'm kind of an introvert, but I can also stand on stage. And this was the case back when I was, even in junior high. Oh, look, Seth, is a polished young man. We need to put him out front. So Youth for Christ and all these other things are interested in. And so, while they were content to sort of be behind the scenes, I was more of a visible guy, But even then, I was more temperamental and I was more volatile and I upset the apple carts, even when I disagreed with my parents in terms of theology. I remember they loved the televangelist Oral Roberts. In fact, they met at Oral Roberts University, right? So they nearly deified the guy. And I always thought he was just a con man. And so all my, rest of my family would be like, keep the peace. Don't talk about Oral Roberts. I'm the one sitting across the table going, that guy's a joke. He's getting rich. He's full of crap. I was always that guy. So that part of my personality was always there. But, we were pretty tight. We'd have conversations about whatever, we spent a lot of time together. And when I left the nest, I really left. I mean, I didn't feel like a strong boomerang back home. I'm a pretty independent force. I didn't feel any sense of like emotional separation, really. Not until I started to disagree. And then you really see the temperature change. And, that's tough. That's a tough thing to see happen. Then resentment builds. You're like, well, look, if you're not going to resent me for who I am, screw you. Those things happen in your middle. Fine. If I don't get to talk about me in my life and I don't get to be authentic while you do. And I'll tell you, the other challenge I've got is my parents put atheists in a cookie cutter. Like, this is what atheists are. I love it, by the way, when believers tell atheists what they are, what they think, what their value system is, what their philosophies are. I love it when
nonstop struggle for us.
They always tell, well, you're an atheist, so you think this. And I'm like, well, no. And where did you come to that conclusion? Right? Often they'll know the caricature of the non-believer in God. I remember one conversation I had with Dad, and he's like, the atheist their life is filled with joylessness and sadness and a lack of purpose. And, there can be no goodness, no joy without the Father kind of thing. It's how my father talks. He really does talk that way. And I told him, Dad, I'm happy. I've got a good life. It's filled with purpose and goodness and love and laughter. And I'm in a really good place. And his response was, I don't think so. It doesn't compute. He, tilt. He doesn't process because, if the atheist doesn't fit in this box, and this is true with my parents for all of the people they have othered, whether it's people from other nations or Democrats, because they're hardcore Rush Limbaugh conservatives. Democrats are all this. They're all, gleefully aborting babies as they try to turn the country into national socialist state, and they want to ruin freedom, and they hate Christmas and blah, blah, they just have all of these caricatures. And you try to, explain to them that your perception about what all this is really wrong. You are embracing a cartoon of what I am, but you don't know me, and I'd like you to get to know me. But if they were to allow that vulnerability, what happens in their own belief system? That house of cards may fall. If they start to think, well, maybe Seth really does have goodness in his life and doesn't need God's for it. And what if he can generate his own sense of purpose? What if he can love properly and loyally and be a genuinely meritorious human being, but he doesn't require my religion to do that? I mean, the implications of them making that admission, they're essentially nullifying a part of their critical faith. And so instead of doing that, they just double down. They continue to other me and talk about the cartoon of me instead of addressing me as a three-dimensional human being.
No, I think it's tough for them because they're so used to believing everything they believe, without question, Yeah. And when you come along and you say, well, hey, you got it wrong, it's not you trying to clear up a misunderstanding with mom and dad. It's you arguing with God.
Yeah.
And there's no way you're going to win in that conversation. They can't hear you. They shouldn't hear you.
Yeah. Well, if they see the prodigal, right? We need to bring the prodigal home. If they see you as a pet project, if you are a mission field, they've already objectified you.
Yeah.
And, I'm not a project. My life is not your mission field. I'm not broken. I have every right. I remember once being on the phone with my mother, do I have the right to pursue truth on my own terms? To try to pursue an authentic life on my own terms. She couldn't answer the question, which was a no, is what she was trying to say. But, and if I was to ask, I'm sure, do you accept me, your son, as I am? I don't know if I would get a yes answer. I would probably get a silent answer or none or a no, because acceptance means endorsement. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, what a tragic place to be. Think of all the goodness I missed out on when I was that person, because I used to be a lot that way. I I didn't know much about the world, but I knew they were wrong. I didn't know much about my own religion, but I knew it was right. I lived in this tiny little sandbox, and I felt secure and safe and superior, and I was missing out on the rest of the world. It was my late 30s before I was introduced to all of these other things, and I felt like I wasted so much time. But now, I'd never go back. I'd never trade all this in to go back into the matrix, and I want to communicate that to them. But when they're not listening, when they're in rescue mode, those conversations usually end in frustration. And if I'm to be totally transparent, I gave up on those conversations with my own family long ago.
Do you feel like resentment is a component on either end of this relationship equation?
I hear some people say, I'm mad at my parents because they lied to me, meaning they taught a fiction as fact. I don't care much for that statement because my parents believe that they were teaching us what was true, and they were operating in that way because they felt what they were doing was good and right. They were trying, desperately trying with all of their might to do the right thing. So I'm not angry with my parents for being true believers and just trying to rescue us from hell and give us salvation and the love of God and whatever. I mean, they're indoctrinated, they're brainwashed, but they weren't evil,
Yeah.
My resentment came when they would use the family card to cross boundaries, and families are notorious for doing this.
Yeah.
Parents will say, well, this is not how I raised you, which is an amazing declaration because what it says is you don't have your own autonomy. You are an echo of me, right? I raise you this way, and when you grow up, you will marry the way I think. You will think like this, act like this. You will vote like this, worship like this, and you will live according to my template or else. And then you don't. And then often families will give themselves permission to play the family card to cross a very intimate personal boundary. They walk into your life in very personal ways to shame you and to call you this and say that you're an embarrassment to the family. And we failed as a parent, that kind of emotional blackmail. If only, I've heard this one, if only I'd done a better job of sharing the love of Jesus with you. How could you do this to your poor mother? That kind of thing. And that's when the resentment in me began to build because it wasn't just about a disagreement, even on a critical issue. It was about family member deciding that because they were on my bio family tree that they had permission to waltz into my house and into my life and into my relationships and into my value systems and just pronounce me everything short of evil, if not evil outright. And it went on for so long. I mean, I get text after email, these long diatribes saying you're wrong and do this, and you're just following the religion of Richard Dawkins, and you can't be moral, and you can't have joy, and you're going to burn in hell, and who knows what else. I finally just said, if you do not stop, I will block you. I will remove you from all of my correspondence. So please stop. Okay. You're going to have to trust your God enough to believe that if you prayed for my salvation and your God cares and is listening, that he's got it, right? You've handed the baton. If you genuinely believe that, then you're off the hook and you're going to have to trust the God that you say is so powerful and stop with all of this, badgering. And it was a reflex. They simply could not stop. And so I got more texts and I got more emails and I went through and I just pulled it up and hit block contact, block email, block, and everything hit a wall. And I blocked them for most of a couple of years. They finally got the message. And now at this moment, we have a rather uneasy peace, but it is a kind of peace and it's better than nothing.
Thank you for listening to When the Bough Breaks. As always, please remember to like, follow, and share. Links in this week's show notes.
They finally got the message, and now at this moment, we have a rather uneasy peace, but it is a kind of peace, and it's better than nothing.
It's more of a ceasefire than a mending of fences.
It's an absence of conflict. But I'll tell you this, and I've told this story in the past. I don't mean to blather on, my friend, but there was a family member. I told this story on the show, but maybe your listeners haven't heard it, but it's such a good case study. I got a cousin. She's like 15 years older than I am. And we saw each other when I was growing up off and on. We were never hugely close, but we had real affection. Her name is Sue. Well, Sue lives in Chicago, and I got a message. This was a few years ago. Got a message from my sister. Hey, Sue's going to be in town. And this is like a rare thing, and we'd sure love for you to stop by and see her. I'm sure she'd love to see you. And I said, okay, great. So I showed up, and so the family's there. We're all sitting around this great big table, and there's Sue and her husband, Mark. And Sue's just trying to catch up. And she doesn't really know much about me or hardly anybody, what we've been up to. So she starts to go around the table. Hey, so what do you do for a living? And tell me about your life. And so, I've got a brother-in-law who's a deacon at the church with a seminary degree. And his kids are on missions trips doing evangelical work. And, someone else has a job in medicine and all, they're so proud of it. Someone else has a job doing this. And, someone else works as a volunteer in the school. And they're coming around the table, and I'm shrinking in my chair because my parents are sitting right there.
Yeah.
And after all of the just junk that's happened and all the conflict and all the shouts and all the tears, I'm like, please, I just want to get out of this. I did not come here tonight to be put on the spot, to see a big blow up. I'm not here for this. And so I thought to myself, well, all right, I'm just going to deflect, and I'm just going to try to keep the peace. I'm going to be vague. So she comes to me and she goes, so what do you do? And I said, well, I'm an online broadcaster. I do audio production, video production, and some online broadcasting. And it's something along those lines. And then I said, and I kind of deflected to the person next to me, but I could tell she wasn't at all satisfied with that answer. Like, she knew there was a lot missing. So she comes back to me. Well, what's your podcast about? And I said, well, again, the podcast is called The Thinking Atheist. My mother and father sitting in front of me like statues. And I said, we deal with religious issues. We talk about issues relating to religion. And I stopped with that, and tried to deflect. And, she wasn't going to be satisfied with that either. It piqued her curiosity even more. And while I was sitting there, I had this moment of clarity that everybody else at that table was able to be, without apology, their authentic self. They didn't sit around and try to, excuse their way out of giving a straight answer, an honest answer about who they were and what they did and what they loved. They weren't over there sitting on their hands thinking, well, I don't want to make anybody else upset, because they didn't have to. Why was I treated with a double standard? Why am I not allowed to talk about who I am, what my value system is, what I do for a living? And so she came back to me and she's like, well, tell me more about this podcast. What is it? And I looked at her straight in the eye and I said, I host the most popular atheist podcast in the world. And there was silence at the table, and I waited for the nuclear meltdown. Yeah, I was waiting for mom and dad just to hit the roof. And it didn't happen. There was a little bit of silence, and then everybody went on. And we got through the rest of the night without incident. And after they went back to Chicago, I got an email. And she said, hey, I've been thinking about what you said. My husband, he's used to be a Catholic, but he's kind of on a journey. Would it be, I'm reading your book, she said, which is crazy. So she picked up my book somewhere on between that conversation and Chicago. And she said, can I give my husband your email address? Because I think you could help him sort of with his journey to encourage him, perhaps. And I'm like, absolutely, And so he and I had this long exchange over the period of weeks. That would have never happened had I not been my authentic self.
Right.
And, he and I would have never had a chance to connect in that way. And I made a pact with myself ever since that day that whenever somebody asks me what I do for a living, unless I just don't feel like talking about it, like I was on an airplane or something, I'm not going to sit on my hands or apologize. I'm going to tell you, I'm an atheist, activist, author, podcaster, video producer, public speaker. I'm just going to throw it out there. You can take it or leave it, but I'm no longer going to apologize for who I am, what I think, or what I do.
No, and that's got to be like quite a big relief for you just to be able to get to that point. I mean, like, I'm not exactly there yet with my immediate family. You know, for many years, I went through that same struggle where it's like I wanted to hesitate talking about my deconversion, my atheism. You know, you sort of brush past things.
Yeah. I don't volunteer. I still don't walk in with like, there is no God t-shirts. I mean, I'm not there for that. Right. But I mean, if someone approaches me in good faith and says, hey, tell me about what you do. Okay, fine. No problem. I do this.
Yeah.
And sometimes they cock their head and go, that's interesting. It becomes a little bit of I don't know, some kind of you see what people are really like when they hear the answer.
Yeah.
Because in the state of Oklahoma, you hear the word atheist and people, think that you are sacrificing babies on a blood altar at night, and you're cackling at the moon. And they have this wild, weird, and then they meet somebody who's just an everyday guy and they're like, really? But more than a few people have heard about me and been curious, and they'll pick up a book or they'll ask me to sign one and they'll go read it. And we'll actually have conversations, maybe over dinner, about, what's that about? What's this about? And my hope is that, if nothing else, even as I try to plant the seeds of real discussion and curiosity in them, that we realize that we probably have more in common than we have apart. And we all want goodness. We want people not to be harmed in this world. We love our families. We're human beings. And that's been my biggest goal. Let's get past the stigma and the caricatures and the cartoons, and let's try to find each other as sort of common agents in the human experience.
Well, that's one of those areas in which you have been instrumental in adjusting the trajectory of my life. Like I said at the beginning of our conversation, that I was very nervous in engaging with you because you are one of my heroes. But it's not because, you're a big deal in the online community or that, you've got the most popular atheist podcast on the planet. For me, it's a lot more personal than that, because when I first started coming into a crisis of faith, and that's all it was, I didn't think I was in the process of losing my Christianity or anything like that. I'd come across some of your online work. And what I realized was two things. First of all, that every area of my life had been overshadowed by Christianity, and that was problematic for me. I needed to examine all of that. But more importantly, I realized, because of what you had said, that all of us, regardless of how different we perceive ourselves to be from each other, have infinitely more in common than we have in conflict. And that really made me hopeful that I could go through these big changes, but still manage to relate to the people that I love the most.
Well, that's a tremendous encouragement to me. And I thank you for that. I mean, there are some people out there who are genuinely awful people, and we can just look at them and say, yeah, that's awful, Yeah. But I'm amazed at how often, religion's kind of a window dressing for a lot of people who live their lives as humanists. In fact, we see a lot of the work that churches do. What they're doing is essentially humans helping humans. That's humanism. Many people in the church are doing what they do because they genuinely want to help. They're kind, compassionate, encouraging, charitable people who often don't get the benefit of the doubt by atheist activists, because we're guilty as well of tribalism and othering people. Sure. I mean, there are others who, genuinely are doing, they're using charity as an excuse to try to indoctrinate people. But I mean, I just think people are so often people. I've met beautiful Christians and I've met horrible atheists. So beyond whatever label you are, I always am interested in what kind of a person are you? Let's start there.
So in a way, I mean, with all of your atheist activism, with your public speaking, with the podcast, the outreach, the relationship building, everything you do, in many ways, it sounds like it's kind of a sideways step from your years in the ministry, from your years of doing the things that made your parents proud. And as you've already alluded to, you're a really big deal in these kind of circles. Have your parents ever to your knowledge, read your books or listened to your podcast or heard any of your speaking engagements?
No, I mean, I'm sure they haven't. It's funny. I remember back when my autobiography, Deconverted, came out, 2012. Our paths crossed, and Mom said, "I heard you wrote a book." And I think I said something like, "Well, yeah, would you like to read it?" She's like, "No." Well, something along the lines of, "Well, whatever you said, I know it's wrong." And that's their approach. I don't think they're at all interested. They don't. There may be some people in the family tree who have sampled at a podcast or a video somewhere, but there is a conspicuous lack of interest. They know it exists. They don't really dive in past knowing it exists. I don't think they're all that interested in hearing the challenges to their faith. Maybe that drives part of it. Maybe it's just easier to stand on the high mountain and say, "Oh, poor Seth, we just need to continue to pray for him and show him the love of Jesus. And one day he'll come back to the fold. And Jesus loves him so much." It's always easier to do that. I mean, when I was a devout believer, I wasn't interested in disconfirming opinions or legitimate criticisms of my faith. Why bother? I already had the answer with a capital A in every conflicting piece of information. Well, that was a piece of the devil. I don't want anything to do with the devil, And religions have these protective mechanisms placed in there like that. They're just they're baked into the whole program. But to my knowledge, they don't read my books. They don't watch my speeches. They don't follow my work. No.
Yeah. I guess it's one of those areas where we, as the atheists in the equation dealing with religious family members, we've got a bit of a more difficult situation to navigate in that they can be really harsh with us at times, just downright abusive and mean, but they don't have to suffer with the guilt complex that comes along with that because they're doing quote unquote the right thing. Whereas if we want to stand a similar ground, we want to approach them just as directly and be just as vocal with our beliefs and our perspectives, even knowing that it's going to be poorly received, that their feelings are going to be hurt. We don't have a similar justification where we can say, okay, well, we're doing the right thing. We're doing God's work. Do you feel like you're disadvantaged in some ways in trying to approach certain topics with your mom and dad?
Well, I don't really approach much with them anymore. I find it interesting that they get so upset and they're so freaked out. They're so constantly concerned and obsessed. They're always, I can tell the sort of the buzzing in my family tree about me. I know when I leave the room that there's all sorts of nauseatingly condescending piety going on, perhaps even a prayer on my behalf. I know I'm not stupid. But I always think it's just odd, and I think extremely telling, that they are so threatened by a disagreeing position. If they believe in a God that cannot be harmed, and they know that omnipotent God would never be concerned about a pithy human atheist like myself, right? That God's already won the battle against evil. And if they believe that prayer works, and they've already prayed for my immortal soul, that God would reveal himself to me, and they've already named it and claimed it, and all these things, that's already the case. Why in the world would they ever be worried about a guy like me? Why would they be so fitful and anxious and uncomfortable, squirming in their chairs and constantly wanting to blurt out something, because they can't not be an apologist or whatever. At the moment, they have to do it because they can't get comfortable. Well, why not? And I think, there may be a few reasons for that. Perhaps part of it is that they genuinely do believe I'm going to hell and nothing else can be enjoyed unless I'm rescued, But I also am suspicious that deep down, when they're being honest with themselves, nobody's looking. I wonder if they, in some cases, some of them at least, have a deep-seated insecurity about their own faith. It's a fragile faith. So, if they were to exist in the same space with a disagreeing opinion, They're fearful. What happens if there's a crack in the glass? What happens if he says something I can't refute or that actually makes sense? What happens if he revealed something about my faith that's actually genuinely immoral and that I can't defend as a moral creature? What happens if my back's against the wall and I have to do some serious and honest self-reflection? What if? And, that's insecurity, which is weird for people who claim just true, steadfast, absolute belief. Right? I think many of them under the surface are really insecure about their religion. And so a defense mechanism against that insecurity is to only surround yourself with reinforcement. Everything is confirmation bias fully in play. You make sure that everything around you is an echo of your faith. You live in a cocoon and you are never legitimately challenged. I think that's common in the faith for sure.
Yeah. You having gone through the deconversion process, do you ever wonder if your parents are enough like you where they would be capable of indulging in certain questions?
I'd like to say never give up on people. Like if I can be reached, maybe they could be reached kind of a thing. But there was a sunk cost issue with them. I mean, they're both in their mid-80s. They have been not just believers, but apologists, theologians. My mother wrote and published a Greek New Testament study guide used at the college level and teaches, or at least before COVID, taught New Testament Greek. My father, I mean, their belief is so woven into their identity. So now they've downloaded it into their children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren at this point. I don't see them ever changing their minds. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know, what that even looks like. I suspect, though, a lot of it is that they are very prideful people. It would be humiliating to them to admit that they had spent their 80-plus years living a lie. Yeah. Wasting their time, misleading, not directly, not intentionally, but misleading their family members who all went off to become believers and give birth to more believers, etc. Right? I mean, the implications of them stopping and saying we're wrong on so many levels, I think, is something they would never entertain, and I think that's tragic.
You are listening to When the Bough Breaks.
We see that it's possible. Dan Barker used to be a pulpit preacher, and his parents were Bible believers. When he became an atheist, he had those hard conversations with his mother and father, and they're both atheists. So it's possible. When I look at my mother and father, knowing them, given their history, given the context, I don't have any real expectation they'll ever budge an inch. No, never.
Okay, so with that being said, is there any hope of actual functional, fulfilling reconciliation? Because I mean, it stands to reason that you're never going to be convinced that magic is true and that Jesus belongs in your heart again. And just as much, your parents are never going to be convinced to evict Jesus. This is always going to be a huge conflict.
Well, I don't have a problem with the disagreement itself. My problem is in regard to the violation of boundaries.
Yeah.
The naming and the shaming and the emotional blackmail, the familial blackmail. That's made it really hard. I suspect my father's in failing health. And I don't know what the next year is going to hold, but it's going to be tenuous. And I'm at this point where I've had those conversations. What does that even look like? I'm sure I wouldn't be asked to speak at his funeral. I'm sure it's going to be a hugely religious affair.
Right.
I certainly would be there as his son, public safety provided. But, while everybody else is saying he's in a better place and one day, God called him home and well done, good and faithful servant. They're not, even though I would not use that platform as my soapbox, talk about our disagreements and my atheism. I think funerals need to be about remembering those who we've lost. I'm pretty much convinced that I would not be asked to participate for that reason.
Yeah.
And then how would I feel when you are pretty much a stranger and you've already kind of grieved the relationship, which I have. I mean, I grieved my father and mother a long time ago. How does that even play out? What's it look like? What's it feel like? And I don't know. I told Natalie, like, one day down the way when the phone call happens and my father has died, what will I feel? An overwhelming sense of grief and loss? Will I still be looking at it through glass? Will I feel anything? Will I feel everything? And I just don't know. And I think this is one of the reasons why in my own activism, I try to encourage families to acknowledge and protect boundaries, because to try to see each other as human beings in the hopes that it might prevent some of this in their lives. I actually did a video about a man. There was a man who's he and his wife were believers. When they were engaged, they got married, and then he deconverted after they'd already had a kid. So their lives are already intertwined. And he's on a journey, right? He's just trying to figure it out. And he comes to the realization he doesn't buy it anymore. He's an atheist. Well, his wife's going, this isn't the deal I made. I thought we were a Christian home. We're going to raise Christian kids. And I thought somebody would be sitting with me in church. And, so she feels like the rug's pulled out from underneath her. And I get that. And she's going through a very real crisis in her heart, And I produced a video called A Letter to a Christian Spouse. It was directed right to this woman and people like her, that essentially said, try not to see the label when you see your husband and see the human being. What has changed? Is he still good? Does he still love you? Does he still love your children? Does he still charitable? Does he still laugh with you? Does he still have a sense of life purpose? Is his life still worth living? All of those things, if you see him as a person first, then you can deal with the disagreements later. And I've spent a lot of my activism, especially in the last few years, trying to draw a big red circle around that, our shared humanity. I'm not successful as often as I'd like to be, but it's kind of a passion of my heart. So.
Well, you've had some experience with that because as I understand, Natalie either is currently or was somewhat recently a person of faith, was she not?
Yeah, she, used to be heavily involved in the Christian church. I don't think she'd mind me saying the way I say it, that I think she is more of a deist these days. She, if someone says, are you a Christian? She'll say yes, because that's the faith culture she came out of, but she's not really engaged with the Bible. She's not dogmatic. I think her God belief is more of I think there's something out there, and I think there's a life after this life.
But she frames that sort of with the terminology she's familiar with.
Yeah. I mean, that's the language that she's comfortable with. If she was a fundamentalist, we would not work. I mean, I'll just admit it outright. Like, if she was like, I want you to be at church with me on Sunday, I could not exist in that universe. I'm not going to go and tithe 10% of my income and put my name on the rolls and sign my identity to a religious faith anymore. I'm not going to do that. But if, my gripe in this world really isn't with the deists. I think there may be something out there. There's something bigger than me, or, we all go on, we'll be reunited somewhere. Or what? I mean, those people aren't the ones right now that I'm doing battle with. They're not the ones who are trying to change the laws to protect and privilege a specific religion. They're not discriminating against LGBT people or people of color. They're not the ones who are, dancing over the state church line to protect power and privilege. The theocrats, that's where my energies go in this fight. The deist, whatever, knock yourself out. That sort of casual, cultural, I just think there's something up there making the rainbows God. I'm not worried about that, because that's not the God that's trying to strip away people's freedoms and harm other people. That's really more of a kind of a window dressing as people live largely secular lives.
It sounds like you've really gone through a journey of learning to identify individuals rather than just sort of stereotype them according to their belief set and whatnot. So I think that's actually a very commendable thing. And I know how difficult that can be. I mean, when I first came out of the Christian faith myself, I had lost a lot in that transaction, because it wasn't just a case of losing everything that I had ever held to be true, but I lost everybody who I thought would always be there at the same time. So there's a lot of resentment that came out of that, thinking, religion is necessarily the culprit. Therefore, all forms of God belief are toxic. But, over the years, I've learned, I guess, as you have, that, I mean, not everybody who holds a God belief or a something bigger belief is an asshole. A lot of them are just wonderful people.
Yeah, I mean, when you're wounded by the faith, it's justifiable to I was mad. I get mad still. And when you are cast off by people for being an atheist, and you realize your friends were conditional and often shallow and petty and really weren't friends to begin with, I mean, we're angry. We grieve that. I think that's natural. And, but when I got into atheist activism, sometimes I would see, religion is a mental illness, is what they would say. And I'm like, no, I wasn't mentally ill when I believed in God. Religion's an idea. I'd been indoctrinated with an idea, and ideas can be changed. My IQ didn't go one way or the other when I was a Christian or an atheist. It's just a fallacious argument. And, we in the atheist movement tend to, we can be guilty of tribalism, and we can be guilty of othering people. And so it's fun to feel superior, to look at a religious person and say, geez, you're an idiot. Those, I've heard them say religitard or creatard or these other slurs. And, they sit there and chuckle at themselves. And I just don't find those things good, healthy, productive. There are some awful believers doing awful things. But there are a lot of people out there who are like us. I mean, I wasn't a bad person when I was a Christian. I had a lot of bad ideas that I thought were good, but I was a victim of bad ideas. And I needed to be disabused of those ideas. And I think, if we're going to change the world, do we sit here and throw rocks at people and say you're an idiot, which doesn't change anybody's mind and only causes them to double down? Or we try to find opportunities to humanize them and perhaps have that discussion over coffee, where we lead with questions as a human being, compassionately with goodwill, in the hopes of maybe seeing that door crack open just a little bit, and telling him it's okay. It's okay. Doubt is not a sin. You're not broken. Curiosity is great. A worthy God would embrace your curiosity. Let's go down the bunny trail. Let's see where it takes us, kind of thing. And I think we have more success in those approaches than simply screaming that religious people are all idiots. Those T-shirts that they might feel satisfying to wear in the microsecond, but they're not going to change the world.
This is going to be maybe a silly question, but I found this question personally difficult when I was estranged from my mom. Do you love your parents?
Yes, I do. I don't feel affection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
If I knew they had a need, and they've had a need. Hey, Seth, could you take them dinner because Dad went to the hospital? Could you drop something off at their doorstep so they'll have something to eat? And if there's a crisis, I would certainly care and want to help to be there in that way. But I don't, when I see Mom on the caller ID, I sigh like, oh. So, I think loving someone and liking them, sometimes those two don't always line up. Is that weird?
Well, no, I mean, I've gone through estrangement from a religious parent myself. So, I mean, I can personally identify with this. I think a lot of our listeners probably can too. It seems that more often than not, matters of faith do become a strong component in these family difficulties, we'll say. I mean, not everything results in a full out cease of contact.
Yeah. I mean, we have pleasant conversations where we talk about, this and that, and we'll even, chuckle and laugh together. So, I mean, we have moments where we do that, but it takes a little bit of work, you know. It's always a little harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, I get once in a while some strange comments from my mom. Like I do another podcast called Turn Up the AC. And on that show, it's sort of like an introspective, retrospective, biographical sort of exploration of how my personal philosophies have developed and are developing. And whereas my mom's not really interested in any of my atheist activism, she's not terribly interested in this show, I think, because the topic of family estrangement is a sensitive one for her.
Yeah.
She is curious about, Turn Up the AC. And, she's listened to basically everything I've ever done. And some of the comments that come out of that are things that maybe you've heard over the years from believers, almost like, you're more of a Christian than some of the Christians I know, because they don't know how to measure goodness without invoking a deity.
Yeah.
Has that been a component of any of your family circle interactions?
When you are trained to see everything in a religious framework, it's a reflex. Like if I go to an atheist or free thought convention, what they see, well, it's a gathering of people with speakers. It's atheist church, right? If you enjoy communal music, and, we'll go and everybody sings. I remember one convention, they played John Lennon's Imagine. Well, and my family would call that religious hymns, or atheist hymns, rather. You have your own preachers. My mother thinks that Dawkins is like the prophet of atheism, and we just simply blindly follow him lockstep. And I'm like, you have no idea what you're talking about, because in the free thought community, the people love him, hate him, everything in between. They agree, disagree. I mean, this whole idea of sort of this blind allegiance and loyalty to a savior figure is just, it's a revelation of how they use religious thinking and religious framing to try to describe non-religious events. I think also the church has done a very good job of stamping a brand of ownership on things that people do anyway. We're communal creatures. We are tribal. We want to get together to celebrate shared interest and pursue common goals. So if you get together to do that, I mean, if you're at a free thought event, you're pursuing common interest. You're learning new things, pursuing common goals to help change the world. Is that church? Well, no more than Comic-Con is church, because that's a common interest of people gathering, or bowling night, or a rock concert, or something else. But when you are programmed to call everything religious by reflex, and also when you're trying to deflect and marginalize, atheism is just another religion, is sort of designed as a conversation stopper. And so they use that as a tactic. And I find it a weird defense, because it kind of marginalizes their own position. Well, your religion's no better than my religion, And I'm like, well,
yeah,
is that really the hill you want to fight on? Because that doesn't seem like true conviction to me.
The views expressed on this show are opinion and experience based and are not intended as a substitute for therapy.
Okay, I know we're getting towards the tail end of our time here, but Alexis, our other host, would very much like to join us in the conversation, even if it's just briefly towards the end here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring her into the conversation, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Hi, Seth. Can you see me?
Hi, Alexis. It's nice to meet you.
Sorry, I don't have my setup here today. I've been kind of busy and preoccupied with family stuff, but I did want to come in and say hello. It's nice to have you on the show. I'm very excited. I don't know if what he's told you. He's a big fan of you. So,
he said you were the hive mind. He said you were the brains of the operation, that all roads lead to Alexis. So I'll treat you with that extra measure of courtesy and respect today.
Well, thank you for being here. It's really glad. It's really great to have you.
Thank you.
Okay, I was just telling Seth before I let you on that you had a question that was sort of like framed from your own personal experience, and I didn't cover that question at any point. I thought maybe that was one that you'd like to ask yourself.
I guess, with coming out of a religious group and then experiencing estrangement kind of all at the same time, I guess my family thought that when I estranged myself, that I shied away from them because I was ashamed. But in reality, I wasn't ashamed. I just knew that watching my deconversion up close would be painful for my family. And I didn't think that they could handle it or I could handle it. And so I thought it best to take several degrees of separation for the benefit of both parties. I don't know in hindsight if that was the best decision, but I felt like that was the one that I had to make. Can you identify with this?
Well, I took the opposite approach. I don't know if it was a good idea, but my parents being theologians, when I began to have doubts and deconstruct Christianity, my first step was to go to them. All right. Well, if anybody's got the answers, it's going to be the wise old man and the wise old woman who've been teaching us the Bible for so long, and began to say, well, what about this in the Bible? And how come this doesn't make any sense? And how do you reconcile this? And I went to them. And so they were part of at least my initial process. And the result was that they just flipped out, because holy cow, Seth's got questions, and these are serious questions, and something's going on with our son. And then they went right into panic and rescue mode. Did you distance yourself because you feared that they would emotionally blackmail you, or did you just need room to breathe while you got your bearings?
Yeah, one of the main reasons was I just needed to breathe. Because my estrangement, it's complicated. I didn't estrange myself just because of religion. With some family things going on, it's a toxic behavior.
Yeah.
And, I felt like that was my last resort. And so I was really dealing with a lot more than I thought going into it. And I guess I shied away because, I wanted room to breathe. I didn't want anyone disrupting this momentum of thought process that I had, this independent thinking that I was never allowed to possess growing up. And so I felt like for the benefit of myself, it was most important for me to separate from them. And I tried explaining that.
Did you tell them at the front end, look, I'm going to take a little time for me, or did you just sort of disappear?
No, I did. I sent them a letter kind of explaining why and what I expected was to have some time. And I guess my mother had received the letter, but she didn't show it to my father. So my father has been wondering this entire time.
Well, I like the idea. Sometimes it's like standing right on top of a painting, and you're trying to see it from an inch away. You're just not going to be able to focus. You can't see the picture. So you have to step back and let your eyes sort of recenter and focus and take it all in from corner to corner to corner. And I think that's something that not enough of us do, especially when you know that there are going to be all these sort of peering eyes on you. And if you had some toxicity and some other baggage going on, I can understand why you'd want to do this on your own terms, at your own pace. I myself, I didn't do it that way, but I will also say that 18-month period was marked by tumult and conflict and tears and shouts and pain, and they made it harder. And in some ways, I kind of envy you that you were able to sort of go to a safe spot where you could breathe the air and focus your eyes and ears and kind of start to figure it out on your own terms without quite as much distraction. And the truth is, and this is it's not contradictory, it's controversial to say, but you don't owe your family anything. Like, we tend to think we owe our families this or that because they're mom, dad, siblings, whatever. But honestly, you really don't. I mean, you don't owe them an explanation. The fact that you told them you're going to take a little time and you took that time, I think is absolutely yours to do. I think that's a great idea.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, it's nice to be validated in that way because, sometimes you do question, did I do this the right way? Could I have done a better job of this?
I mean, I don't know if there's a right way. I'm not Yoda on this stuff, right? I'm just a guy, but the idea that you decided, here's my framework. I'm going to tell my family. You can't control that your mom held the information hostage from your father. That's not on you. And you felt, given your history, this was the best way to move forward. There may not be an A, B answer, but it sounds to me like you did it on your terms, and that's good enough.
Yeah. I think that's good for our listeners to hear too.
Yeah.
No, it's like, and I think this is great actually that I guess all of us get to weigh in a little bit because our estrangement stories are very different. I mean, with you and Alexis, you were more or less the ones that initiated the cease contact. With me, my mom had made the decision for me quite suddenly. But at the same time, there's so much commonality in not just the three of our stories, but also amongst all of the stories that we've heard doing this podcast. When family relationships go wrong, it's painful, it's confusing, but I like what you said that, you don't owe anybody anything. I mean, we owe ourselves to self-preserve, to self-protect, things like that.
Yeah. I like the idea of communicating if you want, just so they know you're not, in danger or, you haven't totally slipped off the rails in some sort of an untoward way, but just say, look, I'm going to take a little time and space. Don't worry, that it's all good. But I'm navigating some stuff. I kind of like that idea.
Yeah, it's like not coming from a place of hate. It's coming from a place of something else.
Mostly just to make your life easier, right? Because if they don't know exactly why you disappeared, now the rumor mill kicks in, and that makes your life more complicated. But everybody, they can approach it any way they want. And I heard somebody say once that all families are dysfunctional. And I think to a degree, that's kind of true. I mean, we tend to fall in love with this idea that, the family next door are the people posting amazing, perfect photographs on Facebook. Well, that's the gold standard of families. And I'm not that. So somehow I failed or fallen short. But the truth is that you're looking at the airbrushing of lives. You're not looking at lives behind closed doors. And all families have their issues, their problems, their bad agents, their drama. They're lovely people and they're horrible people. All families are dysfunctional, and you're not alone in experiencing so many of those things.
Okay, so you had mentioned that you like the idea of being able to communicate or communicating. I know we're coming towards the end of our time here, so I just want to kind of like end with this one question, which is that coming from the place of understanding where you have had a frustrating time of getting your parents to see you for who you are and to understand or even accept your position. If you could wave a magic wand and communicate something to mom and dad and actually have them genuinely receive and accept and understand it, what would that message look like?
Well, I'd like them to see past the label. For them now, it's Seth the Atheist, right? And it's one of those things where everything they see in my life sort of goes through that filter, and it cheats them out of really focusing on a guy who is more comfortable in his own skin than he's ever been. It's weird because when I was a true believer, I was actually more unhappy.
Yeah.
When I believed in God, I struggled more. I was more depressed. Yeah. I blamed myself for the days I was down or the problems I had because, I'm more of a sinner and God must have withheld his blessing. Or, I was totally guilty about everything from, having sexually impure thoughts to what do I do with my gay best friend and how to kind of accept or reject him. And all of my other worldviews, they weren't necessarily fitting, but then I would just ignore them. But that creates kind of an unrest. Man, you come out of that and you look around and you think, I used to believe I was going to heaven. I'm going to live forever in a mansion and I'm going to have perfect peace and joy. And I was terrified of dying. It was when I got out of the faith, I don't believe in an afterlife, that now my fear of death is totally gone. It's weird.
Me too.
It's just weird. And so I would like them to see that. Agree, disagree. I'd like them to see a guy who I'm not sitting around in the corner with my arms tucked around my knees, rocking back and forth, weeping for all that I've lost in a haze of sin and evil and depression and despair. I'm a guy who I finally got introduced to me. Hi, I'm Seth. Great. What do you think about the world? What are your values? Not your parents' values, not your church's values. What do you think? How do you feel about this? What are the terms you'd like to live on? What are the things that are important to you? Who are the people you would like to love? And, man, when you get a chance to do that, it just, it sets every cell in your body on fire. It is one of those things where you think, I wish I had found this sooner, because now I'm no longer jamming the square peg into the round hole. Now I no longer have to take the nonsensical and make it make sense. Now I don't have to spend the rest of my life sitting around judging people, but I get to accept them for who they are, the wild, wide diversity of humankind and thought and ideas and colors and cultures and creeds and sexuality. And it's a potpourri of goodness out here on the other side. And that's what I'd like my parents to be able to see, is somebody who went out and sort of left the cocoon and sort of sampled the rest of the real world and fell in love with it and is very happy and centered in his own life. If they'd only see that guy, I think they would be a lot happier in their own lives, for sure.
Yeah. If somebody wants to find you, what's the best way to go about that?
Well, if you ask my parents, look under a rock or maybe inside a ritual sacrifice, on Halloween or something. But my work is easy to find. I host a weekly podcast. You can find it linked at thethinkingatheist.com. YouTube videos, lectures, other stuff. Or if you want to know more about me, my books, etc., my personal website is SethAndrews.com. Either one of those works.
Seth Andrews, has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time. And hopefully we'll hear more from you in the future.
Well, to both of you, Alexis and AC, I'm just honored that you would invite me to be a part of it. And to any of your listeners, just know that, the human journey is often messy, and that's okay. And just give yourself permission to ask the questions, to pursue an authentic life. Don't let anybody else tell you who you are, and you are not alone. And I'm honored to have been a part of today, and I hope you're safe and good for the holidays, my friends.
Likewise. Thank you, Seth, for coming on the show.